It's Christmas Eve, 1926, and a man stumbles into the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, gasping, terrified, insisting that Santa Claus is right behind him, chasing him with a baseball bat. The staff assume he's simply very drunk. He isn't hallucinating from alcohol in the way anyone expected. Within the hour, he's dead. By the time hospital staff finish counting that night, more than 60 people have come in critically ill from drinking, and 8 of them are already dead. Over the next 2 days, 23 more die across the city. And here's the detail that took people decades to fully process. The alcohol that killed them wasn't some back-alley moonshiner's mistake. It was, by design, poisoned by the United States government. A science journalist named Deborah Blum uncovered the full story while researching a book called The Poisoner's Handbook, published in 2010. What she found was this. Prohibition banned drinking, but it never banned industrial alcohol, the kind used to make paint, fuel and cleaning products, because the economy genuinely needed it. To stop people from drinking that instead, the government had long required manufacturers to add poisonous chemicals to it, a process called denaturing. Bootleggers responded by stealing massive quantities of industrial alcohol and running it through makeshift stills to strip out the poison and redistill it into something drinkable. So in 1926, under the Coolidge administration, federal officials made a deliberate decision. If bootleggers could filter out the existing poisons, the government would simply make the formula more lethal, adding methyl alcohol, otherwise known as wood alcohol, in concentrations high enough that no home still could fully remove it. Here's what that actually does to a human body. Methyl alcohol itself is toxic, but as toxicologist Alexander Gettler documented at the time, your liver converts it into formic acid, a compound roughly 6 times more poisonous. That conversion doesn't happen instantly. It can take up to 5 days, which means someone could feel mostly fine after a night of drinking, then slowly develop crushing abdominal pain, blindness, and eventually heart failure days after the party ended, with no obvious way to connect the two. New York's chief medical examiner at the time, Charles Norris, was furious about it, publicly and repeatedly. He said the federal government knew exactly what bootleggers were doing with industrial alcohol, knew people were dying from it daily, and kept doctoring the supply anyway. Whether or not it was legally murder, he argued, the government bore the moral responsibility for every death that followed. Nobody in Washington reversed the policy. By the time Prohibition finally ended in 1933, researchers estimate the federal poisoning program had killed at least 10,000 Americans. It's worth asking why Prohibition existed in the first place, with that much force behind it. Because the standard story, a nationwide moral crusade against sin, is only part of the picture. 7 years before the 18th Amendment passed, the United States had ratified the 16th Amendment, creating the federal income tax. Before that, a significant share of federal revenue had come from taxes on alcohol, which meant the government had a direct financial reason to keep liquor legal. Once income tax gave Washington a replacement source of money, banning alcohol suddenly became financially survivable, in a way it never had been before. The moral argument may have won the public debate, but the accounting made it politically affordable. And here's the part that might be the strangest twist of all. People generally knew. Newspapers covered the poisoned liquor deaths constantly, right alongside recipes and headlines. It wasn't some secret conspiracy uncovered decades later. Americans understood, in general terms, that the alcohol circulating through speakeasies carried a real risk of blindness or death, and millions of them decided to drink it anyway, calculating that the odds were still worth it for a Saturday night out. That's not a footnote about a few careless people. That's most of an entire country deciding a law had so little legitimacy that they'd rather gamble with poisoned liquor than obey it. And they had no shortage of places to do that gambling. By the late 1920s, New York City alone is estimated to have had somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 speakeasies, roughly double the number of legal bars the city had before Prohibition even started. And these weren't quite the glamorous jazz clubs the movies tend to show you. The overwhelming majority were cramped, low-rent back rooms with cheap furniture and worse liquor. They did quietly change one thing about American social life, though. Legal saloons before Prohibition had almost universally been male-only spaces. Speakeasies, being illegal from day one, never bothered enforcing that rule, and some of New York's most successful speakeasies, including several of its most famous, were run by women like Texas Ganan, who openly hosted a mixed crowd of men and women drinking side by side for the first time in most American cities' history. Because make no mistake, Prohibition wasn't some universally respected moral consensus. Nowhere profited more visibly from the whole arrangement than Chicago, and the man running much of its supply chain, Al Capone. The IRS eventually estimated Capone's organization was pulling in roughly $60 million a year at its peak, from bootlegging, gambling, and a handful of other rackets, at a time when the average American worker made around $1,500 annually. None of that money moved without cooperation, and by most contemporary accounts, as much as half of Chicago's police force was effectively on his payroll, tipping off speakeasies before raids and making evidence quietly disappear. Federal agents spent years trying to make bootlegging or murder charges stick to Capone and repeatedly failed, partly because witnesses were too afraid to testify. He was finally taken down not for the killings connected to his name, and not for the alcohol trade that built his fortune, but for tax evasion, the one crime his own accountants couldn't quite hide. One more piece of Prohibition's legacy outlasted the law itself by decades, and you've almost certainly watched it on television. Moonshine runners in the rural South needed cars fast enough to outrun federal agents on winding mountain roads, so they gutted the seats, reinforced the suspension, and dropped in the most powerful engines they could find, all while keeping the outside looking like an ordinary family sedan so nobody would look twice. After Prohibition ended, those same drivers, with nothing left to smuggle and nowhere to race but each other, started competing informally at county fairgrounds across the South. In 1947, one of them, a former runner named Bill France, organised those informal races into a proper sanctioned league. He called it NASCAR. So if you'd lived through Prohibition as an ordinary person who just wanted to drink, here's what that choice actually meant. You couldn't fully trust your own government not to be quietly poisoning the product on purpose, you generally knew that, and you went ahead anyway, walking into one of tens of thousands of speakeasies that was almost certainly paying off the same police force that was supposed to shut it down. The most dangerous part of Prohibition-era drinking was never really the threat of arrest. It was the very real possibility that your own government had made a calculated bet that killing some of its citizens was an acceptable price for scaring the rest of them straight. Next up, what it was actually like to be an ordinary person building the pyramids in ancient Egypt. Subscribe if you want to catch it, and if a government-run poisoning program is a wilder story than you expected going in, like helps a lot.